Our webinars are also available on our website at drupalforgov.us/webinar. So if you miss one and you want to revisit, these are your two options. Okay, and closed captioning has been enabled. And to get right to it, I'd like to introduce Ashraf Abed. He is the founder and CEO of Debug Academy, where he teaches software development to people of all backgrounds and experience levels. He's certified in Drupal 7 and 8 and a Grand Master, and he was a former technical architect for Acquia. So, Ashraf.
Yes, hello. Let's see if my video will work here. Okay, well, I turned the video on. You can let me know whether you can see me.
I can see you now.
Okay, great.
And you should have access to your co-host. I made you co-host. So.
Okay, great. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen then. Thank you.
And if you have any questions during his presentation, please leave them in the chat. Thank you.
Okay, please let me know if you can see my screen with the presentation.
You can see it.
All right, so I will get started then. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining. As you all know, we're going to be talking about caching with Drupal and a little bit about myself. First of all, thank you for the introduction. Let's see. So I founded Debug Academy, been running it for quite a while now. I, again, worked as an architect at Acquia for a bit, and I was a self-taught Drupal and web developer before that. Nowadays, through Debug Academy, we do various trainings. This caching is pulled out of one of our many courses. So if you're interested in learning more with us, we do have some courses we'll be offering in June and July on Drupal architecture. So if you're looking for a deep dive on some of the more advanced topics, let's say you're a mid-level or junior level developer looking to build Drupal sites the right way from the beginning. In the architect classes, we do a pretty deep but quick dive, deep but concise, I should say, dive on some advanced topics, such as writing maintainable code. And we lead with sort of enterprise examples or examples from enterprise projects that we've worked on. We also have the Acquia front-end certification ramp-up course, which should be available in July. Okay. And we have a number of other courses. If you're looking for custom training or training for your team, please feel free to get in touch. Also, if you're looking to become a developer, let's say you're a project manager or you're in a different field, or maybe you do development but not Drupal development, we do have a part-time 3-month course which takes you all the way from beginner level with no development experience to where you can be a comfortable Drupal front-end developer. That course starts in September. All right, gonna breeze over that slide. I meant to actually hide that one. Excuse me, but let's talk about caching. Now, at a minimum level, Drupal developers tend to be familiar with this concept of clearing the cache. So why is caching such a big part of Drupal? Why are Drupal developers so used to clearing the cache? Most Drupal pages typically consist of multiple entities. They consist of maybe multiple articles, multiple pages displayed as teasers, that sort of thing. And I'm going to actually be bringing over an examples periodically, but so one single page in Drupal typically has a header region, a footer region, various blocks. It might have the main content for the page. It might have a view which lists multiple pieces of content. So really one page is actually typically built using many entities. And so building that one page can take quite a bit of time. Let's see. And just one question. So before I go too far, we're good with the captions. It does say captions are enabled. I cannot see captions, but I assume we're good to go there.
Yeah, I can see them.
You can see them. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so what does caching let us do? Caching lets us do that effort of building a complex page, of rendering a complex page once, saving the output of that process and reusing that output going forward. So let me give you an example of one of these pages that consists of multiple pieces. Hopefully you see the Debug Academy website and you see this popular courses heading. Beneath it, we have this Drupal 8 and 9 web development block, which shows a piece of content. This is a node. And we have two other blocks beneath it, two other pieces of content. So the first time someone visits this page, every one of those pieces of content or those nodes has to be loaded. And so the very first load of this page might be somewhat slow. But once this page loads, the final result is just HTML, CSS, maybe some JavaScript and images. And so the second time I load this page, if I come and just press refresh, it reloads really quickly. So there was a quick flicker and the page just came right back. And that's because the second time and the third time and the fourth time that somebody visits this page, Drupal is not rendering it. It's not rendering those three blocks again. Instead, Drupal remembers the output last time around and it returns that same output. So it goes straight to the HTML, CSS, JavaScript that it saved from last time around. And that's what it delivers the second time. So caching is essentially, I always refer to it as the short-term memory of your website. It remembers what it gave you last time, so it can give it to you again without thinking about it too hard. So again, why are these requests without caching? Why are they time-consuming? A lot is actually happening when you make a request. First, the user, they start at their browser. Maybe they open Google Chrome and they say, I want to go to Drupal.org, for example. So they put in that page request. And what happens behind the scenes is basically a lot of code runs. Behind the scenes, there's something called the kernel. It receives the URL as well as any parameters in the URL. It passes that information to something called the HTML controller. That builds something called a render array. That gets passed to something called the main content view subscriber. That further populates the render array. The final render array gets passed to this thing called the HTML renderer. And finally, Drupal turns it into HTML and CSS and passes it back to the user. So you see, rendering a page is quite complicated. But if once you render the page once, if Drupal can just remember that HTML and CSS or cache it, then the next time somebody comes here, they can basically make their request and skip right past all of this other stuff, go right to the HTML and have that returned to them. So that's the goal. So how does caching help with the problem of complex, time-consuming rendering? Caching saves the already rendered version of the page. So when someone else visits the page, they receive the already rendered copy of the page. This example might not resonate with everyone, but it might work for some people. If you've ever opened an Excel spreadsheet, just a Microsoft Excel document that had tens of thousands of records, let's say 50,000 rows or more, it typically would open very, very slowly. It might even freeze and be unable to open. Okay, so just imagine that. You're opening an Excel spreadsheet with thousands of rows. It's a big ask to open that. Now, imagine that after it finally opens, you take a picture of it with your phone. Okay, you just take a picture of the final rendered Excel spreadsheet with your phone. Going forward, instead of opening that huge spreadsheet, imagine opening the picture on your phone. The picture on your phone contains the same content, right? But it would open much more quickly because it's not really rendering the details. It's not thinking about where do I have to place the content. Instead, it just remembers where it was last time. So that's sort of like loading something from the cache. It's sort of like looking at a picture of the end result instead of rebuilding it each time. All right, so again, we're so used to clearing the cache. But there's a couple of things we have to keep in mind. It's oversimplifying things to say, we'll just cache the page and give the same page to everyone. You have to ask yourselves, what are we caching? Are we caching the whole page? Does that make sense? When should we re-render, right? If I remember what the Debug Academy homepage looks like, I can't serve that same version of the page a year from today because the courses are going to be different, right? So you can't keep something in the cache forever. In which context can it be used? How do developers configure it? And where do we save the cache? So these are what we're going to be walking through. So first of all, what are we caching? Are we caching full pages? That's the ideal scenario. If you can build your website in such a way that the entire page can be cached, your website will likely load very quickly. But that's not always possible. Are we caching blocks, views, nodes, objects, etc., Twig code, PHP code, CSS, excuse me. There's a lot of options for what we're caching. Some of these are handled by Drupal, some of them are handled by the browser, some of them are handled by our web development server. But there are a lot of different things that can be cached. So looking at this page, for example, this is the courses page on Debug Academy's site. In this case, you'd have to ask, are we caching the entire page or are we caching individual blocks? Again, ideally you go for the entire page, but we'll consider that more closely as we go on. So let's say you decided to cache that entire page. Let's say, again, we'll talk about that courses page on Debug Academy's website. If I cache that entire page, what that means, taken at face value, is if I visit that page, I will receive the page from the cache, right? I'll receive the most recently built copy of the page. Drupal will not need to rebuild it for me. If any of you visit that page, you will also receive the page from the cache. So if we're all receiving the page from the cache, when should that cache expire? When should the cache be cleared or become invalid? There's a couple of standard options. One of them is when the content changes. So if I go and edit that page, then I would want that page's cache to be cleared. Another is sometimes a change in context is what you care about. So for example, I might have it set up so that if somebody on the East Coast of the US visits the page, the course page, maybe I want it to say that class starts at 3 p.m. But if somebody on the West Coast visits of the US visits that same page, maybe I don't want it to say 3 p.m. Maybe for them, I want it to say 12 p.m. because of the time difference. So I might have different cache items based on the context. So for example, which user is visiting it, which role that user has, which time zone that user selected. So that's another option. I can have multiple versions of the cache depending on some context. Another option is I can have my cache only be valid for a specific amount of time. It could be valid for 30 minutes. It could be valid for 24 hours. And what that means is, let's say I visit the page right now, and I'm the first person to visit. The Drupal renders the page. And if I have this rule that the cache should be valid for 30 minutes, what that means is anyone else who visits the page within 30 minutes of me visiting it should receive a copy of the page from the cache, just the same page that I saw. But if somebody visits 45 minutes after I visited the page, then Drupal should not give them the page from the cache. Instead, it should delete that old cache item, re-render the page, and give them the new version. This was actually the most common technique in Drupal 7. In Drupal 7, we put what was called a TTL, so time to live, for each page, sometimes for each view. And we would say, the content on this page is valid for, sometimes people would put it as little as 5 minutes or even less, sometimes 1 minute. And that's because they didn't have anything better in Drupal 7. So they would say, the content on the following view is good for 24 hours. The content on this other view is good for 5 minutes. The overall page can only be cached for 1 minute. See, so this would vary page to page and project to project, but that was sort of the limit without getting too fancy in Drupal 7 of how we would configure these pages. Now I mentioned contexts on the previous slide. Context allows you to create different versions of the cache depending on, certain scenarios, depending on who's looking at it. So you could create a version of the cache per user, which is pretty inefficient usually. But you could do that. You could say, create a cache copy for Ashraf. So every time Ashraf refreshes the page, we load his version from the cache and serve it to him. But if somebody else visits the website, render a different version for them, re-render the page for them, and save their version to the cache. If that sounds impractical, it's not necessarily. There are cases that call for that. Imagine if you have a welcome block that says welcome and then the username, welcome Ashraf to this website. All of a sudden, that block and that page must be cached per user, right? Because if the page says welcome Ashraf and you cache the whole page, all of a sudden that cached item is only valid for me. So that's one of the considerations you should make when you're writing your content and building your website. Think about what content you're putting. Are you personalizing it too much to the point where you're breaking your ability to cache in a meaningful way? You could cache per user role. That's a nice middle ground. Welcome administrator, welcome content editor. All of a sudden, all of the content editors can share a cache item and all of the administrators can share another cache item. So it's not as inefficient. And the ideal scenario, everyone shares the same cache item. So you could just say welcome without specifying who you're talking to. And now the page could be fully cached. We will get to how to actually implement this right now. So as a Drupal developer, how do you choose what should be cached, how long it should be cached, who it should be cached for, etc. So in Drupal 8 and above, whenever you display content, typically the content has a couple of pieces of information associated with it. One of those is called the cache tags. One is cache context and one is cache max age. So cache tags, these are sort of like labels for your content, labels for what you have on the page. And they allow Drupal to remember or to know what the cache depends on. So as a quick example, if I look at the Debug Academy homepage, all right, so I scroll down and I look for, let's say this part, again, this Drupal 8 and 9 web development course. Now, this is a node. It's a link to a node, and the node is type course, okay? And let's say it's node ID 5. It's not, but let's say it is. Okay, so this is a course with node ID 5. This is a course with node ID 6. This is a course with node ID 7. So the cache tags associated with these pages, with these sections. So for this one, it would have multiple cache tags. Again, a cache tag is sort of a label or a categorization of what the dependency is for this item as far as cache goes. I'll explain it more clearly in just a minute. So for example, for this one of the cache tags would be node course. So it's typically written as node : course. You'll see this on the next slide. So this one will have a cache tag of node course. And the reason it would have that cache tag is because this content depends on the course content type. So if the course content type were deleted, for example, or if it were modified, all of a sudden, any items, any nodes of type course that are currently sitting in the cache, they should have their cache deleted, right? They should have it wiped out so that it could be rebuilt next time somebody visits. Another cache tag associated with this piece of content would be node 5, because we said it's a node with ID of 5. So it has that cache tag to explicitly say, if this piece of content, or I should say, if the node with ID 5 is ever modified, then this cache should be invalidated. It should be deleted and it should be re-rendered next time. So without cache tags, you run into this problem where somebody visits the homepage, Drupal caches the homepage, right? So Drupal remembers the output of this page. But then if I go and edit the content and I rename this from Drupal 8 and 9 web development to just Drupal 9 web development, now I have a problem because the homepage still has Drupal 8 and 9 web development in its cache. But thanks to cache tags, as soon as I modified node 5, Drupal sent out a message and said, any page that has the cache tag node : 5 needs its cache deleted immediately. So this page, this home page, its cache would be deleted from the system so that the next time somebody visits this page, Drupal has to re-render it. So that's cache tags. So this would have node 5 associated with it. This would have node 6. This would have node 7. But the overall page would have node 5, 6, and 7 as its cache tags. It would also have any other content that appears on the page. So this is from the testimonial content type. So this might have nodes 10, 11, and 12 also added to this page's cache tags. And if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I do have the chat open. So cache tags allowed Drupal to proactively clear items from the cache as soon as any dependent content is modified. Okay, so that's what cache tags do. Now, what if you want to have multiple versions of the cache, again, depending on different user roles or time zones? That's called a cache context. So you would have to tell Drupal, for this view, I want it to vary based on the context of user or based on the context of time zone. And then Drupal would automatically create different versions of the cache for each one of those categories. Okay, and finally we have max age. Again, this is the one we used in Drupal 7. We still use it in Drupal 8, but our goal, Drupal 8 and 9, I should say, but our goal with the age of the cache is to make it as large as possible. If you have the page's cache set to only being useful for 1 minute, it's not all that useful, right? Because if I visit the page, I'm the first person to visit, Drupal has to work hard to load the page. And then 1 minute later or 2 minutes later, someone else visits the page. Drupal will have already expired the cache from when I visited. And so now Drupal has to rebuild the page for the next person. So really the goal is to maximize the max age. So you might go for 1 year or multiple years. Drupal does have, as you'll see on an upcoming slide, Drupal does have a permanent property or constant that you can use for the max age, and it will put the highest reasonable value. A question in the chat: do all of the CDN providers, we'll talk about CDN providers, do all of them have an awareness of cache tags and context? Or do you need to keep that in mind when shopping around? You do need to keep that in mind when shopping around. So if your site is, gets a lot of visitors and has, uptime concerns and such, you likely will have multiple layers of caching outside of Drupal, which we will talk about. But those would include things like Varnish and then a CDN. And CDNs are things you buy typically from companies like Acquia, Fastly, Cloudflare, etc. So you do have to look at those companies and see, do they support cache tags? And when Drupal 8 first came out, Drupal 8 supported cache tags, but a lot of the CDNs did not. But today, more of them do. So we talked about cache tags, cache context, and max age. So where do you set those? You typically set them in render arrays. Render arrays have been around since at least Drupal 7, and they basically contain a structured array representing the page's content. So you might have an array that has a section for each region of the page, like page top, page bottom, page. And if you were to dig deeper into each of those layers, you would find the actual content for that page. But at each layer of the array, you might find a cache key. So if you ever have access to the render arrays in your custom module or theme, look for a cache key and try to expand it and see what it contains. it would probably contain tags, contexts, and max age. So if you want to change the cache tags or add additional cache tags, or if you want to create a cache context or specify a max age, you would do that in the render array typically. And you would do that by just adding to the render array a cache element, a cache key with these properties, which we will see on an upcoming slide. So I already talked about this a bit. But yes, in Drupal 8, cache tags are part of core. And this is a pretty big deal. In Drupal 7, we didn't have cache tags at all. One of the things that made me realize how big a deal it was is I think I remember it might have been LinkedIn. It was either LinkedIn or Facebook, but one of them did this announcement of a big technical accomplishment that they made on their platform. And what they described having accomplished was basically cache tags. They basically said, we did this great thing. We installed cache tags on our website. They didn't use the same words, but if you read through it, they described the same thing. And they said, this is the modern way to do things. It's really complicated. We're really proud to have done it. And, I realized Drupal 8 comes with that out of the box. So I'm not saying LinkedIn could have been built with Drupal 8, but I am saying, we have pretty powerful caching abilities to the point where others are bragging when they replicate them in their platforms. So here's one example of render arrays. Now you can create a render array with markup as usual. So this portion is sort of out of scope for this conversation. Remember, render arrays are a representation of the content that is going to be displayed. But the part that I want to focus on is this middle part. So if you have a render array, you could add a cache key, and you could further add contexts or tags or max age, or all three. So in this example, we're adding a cache context of user, which means this render array should have a unique cache per user. And why would we do that? Because if you look at the content for this render array, it says hi and then name. So they're going to get the username. So hi username. Hi Ashraf, welcome back to the site. So we don't want to cache that and share that cache across multiple users. So to avoid that happening, in the same render array, we add a cache context of user. Now, in addition to the user cache context, you also want to take it a bit further. And not only if a different user logs in, do you want the cache to change, but also if the current user changes their username, you also want the cache to clear. If the website name is changed, you also want the cache to clear because it says welcome to site name. So Drupal does have a render service, which has a function named add cacheable dependency. So you could call that function add cacheable dependency. You can give it your render array, and you can give it the dependency. So the config where you're getting the site name, or the user whose name you're displaying. And basically Drupal will enhance this caching information that you added. It will get the cache tags from the user object. It will get the context and such from the user and the config. How do the three different cache keys work in conjunction? Are they additive? So if you have something that says cache context user, max age 1 hour, will Drupal know to get the new version after 1 hour if the user has not changed? Yes. So basically, yeah, I almost think of it as everything you add is an additional restriction. but they all apply simultaneously. So if you say that it has a max age of 12 hours and it has a cache tag of node 5, if 13 hours pass, the cache will be cleared. Or if 13 hours have not passed, let's say only 1 hour has passed, but node 5 was modified, the cache will also clear and the clock will reset. So yes, it factors all of them in simultaneously. Yep, thank you. So a couple of examples of cache tags here. Node:article, node:1. So node:article is a cache tag that basically means clear this item from the cache if the article content type is changed. So if someone adds a field to the article content type, for example. Node:1 basically means clear this item from the cache if the node with ID of 1 is modified. So if someone edits it or deletes it or anything like that. Node_list is a cache tag that basically means if any node in the whole site has been updated, then clear the cache for this item. This is a common cache tag for views. So if you're making a view of many nodes, the view will typically have a cache tag of node list, which means if any node on the whole site was updated, that view should get its cache cleared. The nice thing is you don't really need to know exactly what these cache tags are. It's good to be able to recognize them. So if you see node 1, you can kind of figure it out. That probably is talking about node with ID of 1. But these are not things that you are typing very often. These are typically provided by the entities automatically. So if you create a block and you put it on a page with a layout builder, it just takes care of this all for you. Where you have to worry about is really mostly when you're writing custom code, so like a render array, or you're writing a pre-process hook in a template and you're loading some value from a node somewhere and you're passing it to a twig file. That's a scenario where Drupal's not going to just magically determine the caching information. That's a scenario where you should figure out what cache tags are needed. Potentially, you might be able to use code similar to the one on the slide we just went through. But those are the scenarios where you would need to handle that caching information yourself. There's something called cache tag bubbling. I talked about this indirectly. So not only do cache tags exist at a page level, but the cache tags exist pretty much at every level. So on the Debug Academy page I was showing you earlier, we saw a course. We saw the Drupal 8 and 9 course, right? That was in a block. So that block has the cache tag of node 5. It was also in a view. Okay, the view was listing 3 courses. That view also has the cache tag of node 5. See, it bubbles up. So that view is placed on the page. So the page also has a cache tag of node 5, in addition to many other cache tags. So you see, whatever element provides a cache tag, whatever entity provides a cache tag, it provides that cache tag to itself as well as to any of its parents or ancestors, and it bubbles up all the way through to the whole page. So at the page level, pages record cache tags from every single piece of content on that page, every entity on the page, every render array on the page. And having that information allows you to say, I'm editing node 5, and it allows Drupal to then conclude, okay, we need to clear the cache on the home page. We need to clear the cache on node/5. We also need to clear the views cache on the home page because that also has node 5 as a cache tag, we also need to clear the block within that view and the content within that block. Are cache tags enabled by default, or do they need to be configured thoroughly? It all works out of the box. Our goal as developers is basically not to break it, because it works well out of the box. It's just when we start writing render arrays and pre-process hooks and custom twig code sometimes, that's when we risk introducing content that does not have its caching information bubbling up. We will take another look at it. We'll take a look at another example of that. So here you can see, if you have a node on a page like that course, and that node appears in a view, and that view appears on the page, the cache tags will come from that node. So it might be node list, might be node 5, you might have a bunch of them. But that cache tag bubbles up from the node to the view. So the view also receives the same cache tag. And the view's cache tags bubble up from the view to the page. So the page also receives all of the cache tags from the view and all of the cache tags from all of the nodes in that view. And that makes it so anytime this node list cache tag is triggered or it's invalidated, the page's cache will be cleared, the view's cache will be cleared, and the node's cache will be cleared. So it happens at all of these layers because we're not only caching the whole page. Drupal will cache the page and the view and the node and the block independently, so that even if, let's say, node 5 gets updated, and that triggers a cache clear for the whole page and the view and the node, if node 6 and node 7 were not updated, their cache can remain intact. So that specific block can still be served from the cache. The view has to be re-rendered and the page has to be re-rendered, but node 6 and 7, they don't have to be re-rendered. So that's what's great about cache tags. It's not only clearing the cache for the page, it's doing it in a very targeted way. It's not aggressively clearing the cache of every single thing that happens to be on the page. Okay, let me skip that. This is what I wanted to get to. So here's an example. This is a build function. This could be a programmatically created page, like a controller, or a programmatically created block with a build function. So in this example, you can see we're creating the markup. We've just got a placeholder function here, and we're specifying the caching information. So for this block, we want it to get its cache cleared every time any node is updated. So maybe the markup for this block says something like, there are currently 100 published nodes, there are currently 20 nodes in draft state, and there are currently 5 nodes have been deleted. So let's say that that's the markup. So in that scenario, we would want the cache to be cleared every time any node is updated, because we would want those statistics to be recalculated. Context, user, the ideal scenario is to have no context, so that the cache is shared between everyone. So I keep using user as an example, but that's almost the worst case scenario. You don't want to have a unique cache per user. Max age. So normally this would be a number in seconds. So if I put max age 60, that would mean this will be cached for up to 1 minute. But if I put permanent, that basically means I want this to be cached for as long as possible, which might be a year or 2. Should we always include cache tags in any custom functions? I'd say anything that you could imagine needing to be updated or needing to be refreshed anything that's dependent on some content or some changes. It's a little hard to generalize it, but for example, I'll give you an example here. I'll actually tell you about a bug on the Debug Academy website. So you see how this block says next course 2022-09-18. That looks fine. But the way that this thing is coded is we actually have a preprocess hook that is passing a date from a different node into this one. And then we're displaying it in the twig file. And so because of that, we would need to programmatically add the caching information, the cache tags to say, if this other node is updated, then this specific block also should be updated. Yes, thank you, Sarah. That's pretty much it. If you're grabbing data from an entity and outputting it somewhere else, you should make sure not to discard their cache tags. So, and that's sort of what I'm demonstrating here. In this example, we're loading a date from a different node and just printed out the date right here. So when you do that, you need to make sure to take the caching information from that node and make sure it's included in this twig file, essentially. Make sure that it bubbles up with the content. So you should include a cache tag. You should retain caching information from whatever it is that you're displaying. Normally, you're not writing those cache tags manually. Normally, it's more like, jump back a few slides. Normally, it's more like this, where we have our render array, and we're adding a cacheable dependency to this other item, to the config that we're using, or to the user that we're using. So by doing this, Drupal will find out all of the caching information that's important for this user and merge it into our render array. And then we don't have to write this information out manually. So whenever you're using a render array and pulling information from one entity into your render array, make sure to also pull the caching information from the content as well. 10 minutes left. I think one of the most important things is to understand what you're trying to do. When it comes down to it, you'll probably do a little bit of research, come across a Stack Overflow post that says, how do I get caching information from my node into my render array? And you'll find someone answering it. But hopefully after this conversation, you will know what to search for, and it should be pretty straightforward. Okay, so the last part, and I intentionally put this last because this is important to know, but it's less directly applicable. Yes, caching is the same in Drupal 9. So everything I'm saying here applies to Drupal 8 and 9 and 10. So where does the cache get saved? This might look scary, but these are all things that more or less happen automatically, especially once your site has been set up. But there are a lot of layers of caching. There's the database, where Drupal can store its cache. There's database queries, which can get cached. There's op cache or APC, where you can cache the actual PHP code. There's memcache, where you can cache PHP objects. There's Varnish, where you can cache whole pages, and CDNs, where you can cache whole pages. They all serve their own purpose, but the nice thing is you don't really have to get deep into configuring any of them. For the most part, you might install a module named memcache and a module named purge or purge varnish, as well as purge for the specific CDN you're working with. So talking about a couple of these, I'm going to breeze past some of these in the interest of time, especially if we have no control over them. Cache is typically stored in Drupal's database by default, nothing to worry about. MySQL query caching, this is something your host will do or will not do. It's not something you typically configure yourself. Opt cache, opcode, or APC, this PHP cache. Again, this is not something you're ever going to configure yourself. Maybe your local development environment, you might need to fiddle with it if you're having problems, but this is not something at the website level. This is something at the web host level. Memcache, again, your host will typically provide it or not. And if they do provide it, you would typically install something like the memcache module. So this will allow Drupal to load entities in PHP more quickly. So if you do like a node load more than once, memcache will help the performance of that. Okay, now I'll slow down a little bit. Oh, let's see, do I mind going back to the Drupal database slide under the caching storage? I'll go there real quickly, but under the caching storage, are you referring to this one? Okay, yeah, so after this one, I'm going to skip ahead because these are things that just happen out of the box in Drupal core. If you have a simple setup, this is where the caching will be served from. It'll be from Drupal's database. But if your site is hosted on Acquia or Pantheon or any one of those hosts, typically most of the caching will be served from Varnish or another external layer. But this is not something that you're likely to turn off. It's something that's just on by default. Okay, so we'll go to Varnish because this is where you start to run into areas that you actually have to be aware of occasionally. So Varnish caches entire pages. It does have the ability in recent versions of Varnish to support cache tags as well as multiple cache contexts. It is up to your host, typically Acquia, Pantheon, to code Varnish in such a way that it recognizes the cache tags and context. And if you're with Acquia or Pantheon, they do support that. So it's not typically something you have to really set up. So Varnish, it's caching in the RAM of the server. It basically is very fast caching that is served by your server. What you need to know is, by default, Drupal will not clear the cache in Varnish. Varnish will cache your page. Drupal will not know how to talk to Varnish to clear it. So even if a cache tag is triggered, it will not make it to Varnish. And that's where this module, the purge module, comes into play. The purge module is for external cache invalidation. So that's for Varnish and for CDNs. So if you're on a host that uses Varnish and CDNs, you would install the purge module and then the corresponding submodules, such as Varnish purge. And by installing those, enabling them, and just glancing at the settings, Drupal's cache tags should then start to communicate with Varnish and with your CDN. So when you save node 5, the purge module will say, hey, node 5's cache tag is being invalidated. What should I purge? And it looks and it says Varnish. Okay, Varnish purge. So it'll purge Varnish. And then depending which CDN you're using, maybe Akamai or Cloudflare, after purging Varnish, it would then purge the CDN. So you would enable the purge module and the Varnish purge module and whichever CDN purge module, and you would follow the module's documentation to enable the purgers so that they all work and work in the right order. So Varnish is very fast caching at the edge of the server. CDN, it's very similar to Varnish, but instead of it being cached on your server, it's cached on other people's servers. So CDNs are content delivery networks. They basically have copies of the cache around the world. And so if somebody visits, a website hosted with Acquia, and it is using a CDN, let's say they visit from Virginia, they might, instead of their request making it all the way to Acquia's servers, their request would go to the nearest CDN server. And so maybe there's one in Virginia, Amazon East Coast or something like that. And so it would go to that server, which is physically closest to the visitor. It will get the cache page from there and load the page more quickly. Whereas someone in Germany visiting the same website might be directed automatically to the CDN server in Germany and given the page from there, so that their request doesn't need to travel around the world. So this is what the request looks like. This is a simplified model of what a request to a Drupal website could look like if you're using all the standard caching layers. So the request starts here. The user says, I want to see debugacademy.com. And the first place their request is given to is the CDN, not even Drupal. So, so far, Drupal doesn't even know that they visited the website. So it's given to the CDN. And what happens is it asks the CDN, someone's trying to visit debugacademy.com. Do you have a copy of the homepage? If the CDN does have a cached copy of the homepage, which fits the context, which is not expired, then the CDN will give that cached copy right back to the user, and that's the end. So that means the user's request will never go to Varnish and will never go to Drupal. That's the best case scenario. That's a super fast request. But what if the CDN does not have that page in the cache? In that scenario, it would pass the request. It would say, hey, I don't have it. Let me give it to Acquia's server. And Acquia's server would first, Varnish would be the first one to step up and say, let me check if I have it in my cache. If Varnish does have it, it will return it to the user. Thank you, John. And if Varnish does not have it, it'll pass the request through all the way to the server. This is the worst case scenario, but it does happen. And so this is where Drupal actually has to render the page. Opcache, memcache, these are just some more internal caching layers. If they're configured, they'll be used. If not, they won't. But basically, PHP and the database are used to render the page, and the page is returned. On its way back, it gives a copy to Varnish, it gives a copy to the CDN, and it gives the response to the user. So next time somebody visits, the CDN has a copy of the homepage, and they can get a very fast response. Most of this, it's just set up automatically if you go with hosts that support it. Okay, so we basically are out of time, but that is that's the gist of it. I mentioned the purge module already. If you want even better performance, you can enable the big pipe module in Drupal core and the quick link module in contrib. Those would help. If you're looking to learn more, I'm the primary teacher at Debug Academy. I mentioned we have the Architect series. So if you want to skip the really long slog of becoming a Drupal architect and just go through a couple of crash courses, somewhat like this, but with a much smaller group where there's interaction, where you can unmute yourself and ask questions, and where I show you code bases from real projects. That's what that course is for. Acquia certification prep, just like the name implies, helps you prepare to take the certification exam. And we also have a number of other courses to prepare you to be front-end Drupal developer, back-end Drupal developer, Symfony, PHP, React, HTML, CSS. and so on and so forth. We do not, our next 3-month course is running in September. In the meantime, we're going to be running these shorter courses. So this is a great time to pick up a lot of, skills without signing away your whole summer. All right, I hope that this was beneficial. And please go to debugacademy.com, sign up for the newsletter. We email once in a while, letting you know when courses are coming up. So I hope that you all enjoyed this, and yeah, I hope to speak with some of you soon.
Thank you, Ashraf, and see you all again next month. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.